It's time now for our very first panel of the 2021 SDG Action Zone. And the conversation we are about to have truly could not be more pressing. Over this last year and a half, we've seen the gap between the haves and have-nots in our societies widen dramatically, with weak social protections allowing so many to fall through the cracks, while uneven availability of financing, unfair debt infrastructure, and opaque tax havens uphold broken systems. With lives and livelihoods on the line, we have a tremendous responsibility to act now. But there's a tremendous opportunity here too. As we look to the future, we have a chance, some might even say a mandate, to reimagine health, to ensure stronger social protections, to design more inclusive economic systems, and to enhance inclusion across all systems. We can actively build a world that tackles the pervasive legacy of discrimination worldwide. And in truth, we must. It's difficult work, we all know that, but we have to believe it's possible. And we have to commit to it with all our resources, our attention, our investment, and our sense of responsibility to each other and to the entire planet. Our guests for today's big picture conversation are living, breathing testaments to that commitment. And we're so grateful to have them with us. First, a South African humanitarian, activist, and SDG advocate who's inspiringly unflinching in the face of inequality and ignorance. Welcome, my friend, Eddie Ndopu. Next, the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, an expert voice who speaks in both powerful insights and substantive solutions. Thank you for being here, Olivier de Schutter.
Thank you.
And finally, a razor-sharp professor, the International Vice Principal at King's College London, who is living her belief that a peaceful and prosperous future depends on young people, women, good leadership, and all the intersections thereof. Welcome, welcome, Funmi Olonishakin. So there's a lot to cover here. We are so excited to have all of you brilliant people with us. And I thought maybe let's start with a burning question. There were so many shocking moments over this last year and a half, so many moments that I and many of us thought and hoped would be inflection points to change and spur people towards action. So I wonder if you could talk to us each about a shocking moment for you and how we might use the stories or lessons of that to motivate people to actually fight inequality coming out of this difficult time. Eddie, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So, Nadira, what I would say is that for me, there wasn't one shocking moment per se, but I think it is the overall return to precariousness. I think for so many communities across the globe, I think the most vulnerable segments of society right now are definitely feeling left behind, are feeling neglected, are feeling incredibly isolated. I think from Afghanistan and sort of what we've been bearing witness on the geopolitical stage to what we are seeing, as far as, people with disabilities are concerned, the constituency that I belong to, and the community that I advocate on behalf of, I think that the general precariousness remains incredibly shocking. I mean, we are several months into the pandemic, and still in the vast majority of the world, many people have no access to the COVID-19 vaccine, right? And yet we're seeing, resistance in many parts of the world to the vaccine, and people who have the resources are simply not, taking advantage of that. So I think, it's not one event. I think it is a series of events that I think bring into view a real sense of precariousness that I find truly troubling right now.
And deeply shocking, because you would hope what we've been through over this last year and a half would have moved us forward on that axis. But you're absolutely right that it's just in some ways more of the same. Olivia, can you reflect a little bit on that, a shocking moment, and how we might use the lessons of that to push us forward?
Thank you. I think what is really shocking is the huge gap between the enormous sums that states have injected into the economy to react to the economic and social crisis. Approximately some 15 trillion US dollars have been injected to support companies and to avoid massive unemployment. And yet a limited number of people have actually benefited from the bailouts and the recovery plans that have been adopted. And what is really shocking is this gap. We still have, according to the most recent data, some 55% of the world's population that has no social protection whatsoever. We have extreme poverty that has increased by 125 million people, when before the crisis there were some 700 million living with less than $1.90 per day. And we have a large part of the workforce, some 2 billion people, 61% of the global workforce, that is still in the informal part of the economy, and that is barely covered at all by social protection measures. So I think this inability for governments to really deliver on their promises despite the huge sums invested is something that is very disturbing, and it is that priority that we should now address.
And in terms of addressing it, if I might just push you on that for a second more, what obviously discussing it here and bringing it to light is crucial, but what are there other sort of next steps that need to happen to sort of close that gap and use that shocking event to get us farther along on this fight against inequality?
I think this crisis is really an opportunity we should seize in order to pressure governments to actually deliver on the right of each individual, man, woman, or child, to have access to social protection. This has not been a priority of governments for many years. And even during the crisis, most of the reactions of governments, when they adopted social measures, were in the form of short-term cash transfers to respond to the emergency, but without really providing legal entitlements to individuals that they may claim, forcing governments to actually provide support. So the priority should be to force governments to deliver rights-based legal entitlements to people that can claim social benefits before independent bodies if they are denied such benefits. But there is lots of work to be done, but the money is there. We've seen governments investing massive amounts in the economy, and there is, of course, a huge gap between rich countries who can afford to do this and poor countries who are already heavily indebted and need much more support. And this is why, with others, we've been pleading for the establishment of a new global fund for social protection, a new international financing mechanism to support poor countries' efforts to establish universally social protection floors. And I very much hope that the pressure is now mounting sufficiently for this dream to become a reality.
And it shouldn't be a dream, it should be a reality, because, you know, I hate to use this sort of colloquialism, but it's almost a no-brainer. We should have a global fund already in place, and yet we find ourselves in a situation that makes it unmanageable that we actually don't. We want to go deeper on that, but first, Funmi, I want to get your take on this last year and a half. What's shocked you, and what do you hope we can translate that to in terms of action against inequality?
Right. No, thank you. I've got to talk about the spectrum of inequality and two sharply distinguishing features of it. One feature which is so truly global in its manifestation is the inequity that starts from the household to the street, to the workplace and the rest of society. I was struck by just the number, the thousands of African girls who became pregnant in the space of the home. I was shocked by the scale of domestic violence globally. And even though this has been mentioned, you know, almost on an ad hoc basis, sometimes, you know, somewhat consistently, depending on the agent, you know, in this conversation, that gender inequity and how it manifested itself at the height of lockdowns globally shocked me immensely. But then if you looked across society and you saw that, you then saw inequalities among societies. And that's similar to the sort of conversation that Olivia is asking us to have, that you look at states where the citizens have been vaccinated twice over. They still have resources to vaccinate, to begin to talk about how you provide boosters for citizens. And then we have societies that have not even had anything close to 10% of their populations vaccinated. How do we deal with these layers of inequity between countries, within countries, between genders, and it just cascades across the board. I think that's the canker that we need to deal with, not just in the discourse, but in the kinds of commitments that we make to citizens across the board.
I think canker is exactly the right word in this scenario. And I'm so struck because all three of you in a way or one way or another talked about pressure. And I love that you referenced booster shots, Funmi, because it's one of those things here in the US that I'm staggered by the fact that so many people who are already vaccinated with 2 shots are angling to get their booster. And yet there are people around the world who have not even had the possibility of being vaccinated. There's a responsibility to others thing there that I want us to talk a little bit about. Why have we not been able to get particularly folks in the developed world, to recognize that it is not just about social media or saying the right things or donating to the right campaigns, but there is actually sort of a moment where you have to put yourself in active discomfort in order to support others because you have a responsibility to do that. How do we pressure folks to actually understand that intrinsically and then translate it up to governments? Because we talk often about pressuring both the public and pressuring governments, pressuring leaders, but I'm not sure I've heard how that pressure actually happens. So I would love to hear each of you reflect a little bit on what the practical mechanisms of exerting that pressure might be. Who wants to go first?
Well, I might take a stab at that. I think that, I very candidly and very honestly, I think what I want to say is that there's a profound selfishness and a profound nationalistic attitude that I think pervades the hallways of decision makers, right? I think we need to be very honest and clear about that, and the way that we respond to global crises probably needs to be reimagined, right? Like I think the way that leaders come together to solve for the most pressing issues of the day, I think is really underpinned by a profoundly kind of protectionist approach to geopolitics and to social discourse writ large, right? So I think there's a question of leadership here that I think is profoundly important and needs some interrogation. And so, I think that's probably where it starts. It's like, how do we think about leadership, right? And I saw a meme the other day that sort of said that, leadership is too important to be left to leaders, right? So I think that, in other words, we need, a multi-stakeholder approach. We need to ensure that the most vulnerable segments of society are not just tokenistically included, but are actually the ones who are shaping global discourse in a really deep and meaningful way, right? And so I that would sort of be my take, is that we need to first be really frank about the fact that that is what's on the table, is a kind of logic that says, what's in it for me first, we'll get to everybody later, without sort of recognizing the ways in which we are profoundly interdependent.
Absolutely, owning it so that we can undermine it. And that interdependence, Olivia, I'd love to go to you now on that pressure question, because the fund that you're talking about and all of these sort of mechanisms that seem intuitive as though they should exist speak to exactly the issue Eddie's talking about, where there's a selfishness and a sort of reluctance to do the real work, to put the money where the mouth is, so to speak, and to actually cooperate globally, collaborate in this universe that we now live in that is global and interdependent. How do we push our leaders to do that? And how do we get them to realize that we don't know they care if they don't actually put the actions and the investments behind the words that they're telling us on television every day?
I think there are two things to be said here. And the first one is that many governments, for a number of reasons, are captured by the large corporations on which they largely have come to depend for their legitimacy and indeed for the financing of the elections in many countries. And I think that is the elephant in the room in many ways. It is that democracy has been increasingly captured and serving therefore the interests of the rentiers of the economy, as described by UNCTAD in its own report. And the second remark I'd like to make is that just like the welfare state in the 1930s and 1940s was built once people came to realize that it was important to stabilize the economy following crisis and to encourage inclusive growth by improving the purchasing power of the working classes, Similarly, in an interdependent world, we should realize that no country shall succeed on its own, that as we need to acquire resources from abroad, as we develop global supply chains, as any of the consumer items we have are the result of a division of labor involving a number of jurisdictions, we must ensure that all people everywhere have access to decent work and decent levels of social protection. And the advocacy for the Global Fund for Social Protection is premised on the idea that our governments will be sufficiently aware of the need to acknowledge this interdependency and the idea that the viability of the global economy depends on all countries being able to overcome this crisis. I do believe that we need more democracy in order to pressure them to deliver on these promises and in order to allow the governments to circumvent the pressures of the big economic actors that are delaying action on vaccines as on other issues that require greater international solidarity.
Clearly, I want to cheer for everything all of you are saying, but especially in that moment, it's like our democracy in a lot of ways has been hijacked, but we need more of it, not less of it. We need the voting. We need people running for office. We need people demanding that their vision of the world is the vision that our leaders are living out, not just that they're, essentially, as you say, being guaranteed by corporations and other interests that aren't always aligned with our own as citizens or as humans. Funmi, I'd love to go to you on this question of pressure because you are also so focused on young people and young leaders and young women and getting them thinking about these issues and hopefully acting on them. So could you reflect a little bit on the mechanisms of pressure that we can exert to get these folks who are actually thinking in line on the subjects that we're talking about now to push leaders and to push their communities as well toward change on inequality?
Absolutely. I have to say, very unfortunately, that much as I love everything that Olivia is saying, and we are all of the same mind here, many leaders know this. They know the theory of it, but they hardly ever, respond or react differently to a lot of the situations we've been talking about. And there's a complacency. Eddie, you talked about leadership. And I think our leaders have focused for way too long on the hardware elements of the leadership infrastructure, where as long as you're seen, really representing your country at the right stages, as long as you're seen in, as leading particular institutions, no one looks at the software dimension, which is where the relationships are formed with those leaders, where actually you expect that any leader, wherever they are from whatever perspective, is able to see, develop the ability to see the world through the eyes of the diversities of people around them. That has ceased to be the case. Democracy, which is meant to actually be, become an inclusive thing that is supposed to help us build a better world, has been hijacked in so many spaces, in so many ways. And I think that one of the ways of building pressure, that way is two-pronged. The first part of it is that if you really look at society across us, the power dynamics in society often suggest that it's those people at the top of a vertical hierarchy that get to think, get to decide for others. But we know from the work of the vast majority of young people globally that they're so transnational in the way that they respond, that they fight for social justice across the board, and that if you allowed them to exercise that agency, they will compel their leaders in many different ways that are still non-violent. But somehow we do not let even their non-violent actions see the light of day. And I think we need to begin to rebuild through the power dynamics of young people, the referent power, the expert power, that bring that to the fold of things and use that agency, bring the ideas that will reshape the world from them instead of doing it on their behalf. I don't think that our global leaders, our national leaders, or even regional leaders have heard that. They haven't heard that.
Clearly, they have not.
Yeah.
Clearly they have not. And I love this idea of dichotomies between hardware and software, because often we're so focused on, are they wearing the right flag pin or any of these kinds of things, rather than what are they practically doing? How are they building relationships? How are they holding themselves and other people accountable? I would love to hear from each of you on what each sector of society needs to do now, because we've talked a lot about what's not getting done and how the folks in power aren't necessarily living out the mission they claim. And we all know it's become very in vogue to be on the side of goodness, right? If you're a corporation, if you're an institution, we have seen this shift where, from a public facing perspective, everybody wants to be on the right side of the movements. Practically speaking, though, that's often not true. So I'd love to hear what corporations need to do. What do citizens need to do? What does civil society need to do? What do leaders in government actually need to do in order to move this conversation forward? Practically speaking, when you're thinking to yourself, these are the things that need to happen for each sector, what are those things that come to mind? And maybe we can start with what corporations need to do. Who wants to take that? Let's do one at a time so that, you know, we don't spend all our time with a prescriptive list. Who wants to take corporations?
I would be glad to say a word about corporations. I think we have been celebrating just a couple of months ago the 10th anniversary of the guiding principles on business and human rights that were endorsed by the Human Rights Council in June 2011. And what's really striking when you look at these guiding principles that are the main reference document describing what is expected from corporations in today's globalized world is that they are entirely silent about the ability for companies to put workers to work where the wages are low and unions repressed, whether or not to pay taxes in low tax jurisdictions to limit tax liability, or whether to pollute in the jurisdictions where the environmental regulations are the most lax or the least well enforced. In other terms, globalization is still benefiting corporations that may choose where to put people to work, where to pollute, and where to declare their profits to have those taxes. And I think this is just not sustainable. And we need to move beyond the minimum requirements that corporations do not violate human rights to a much more positive demand on corporations that they become forces to make globalization more humane and to work for the fulfillment of the SDGs. And this requires to move to a guiding principles 2.0, if you wish, imposing on companies that they become a force for the better. I think it's possible. They have a huge influence in today's globalized world, but today this influence is negative more than it is positive.
Absolutely. And we cannot allow them to create this environment in which human capital is an exploited resource, because that's where we are absolutely right now. What about civil society? What does civil society have to do in order to help us move this conversation forward? Funmi, you ready?
Yeah, absolutely. I have to say that, you know, globally and nationally, civil society needs to make a choice on where it belongs. And being a member, you know, having been a member of that civil society myself, I have to say that there's a measure of complacency that has set in. We're easily co-opted by, you know, the state systems that we also, when convenient, you know, can really challenge, you know, them, at least in theory. I think civil society needs to put all of its efforts to support the larger body of citizens, the very young people whose energy, whose labor, and whose ability to be resourceful would determine whether corporations succeed or whether, in fact, states can stay the way that they are, or state leaders. It's not the states as much as the leaders of those hardware of the state institution. I see the real potential for transformation in where you see an alliance between, you know, really honest civil society that is able to place its time and talent and resources on the side of the transnational, you know, youth and young organizers globally. We see what is possible in the environment. How can't we see a major movement against poverty? If civil society did that, that begins to change the game.
And I love the word honest there, because that is the key to it, being honest and being vulnerable and recognizing the part we're all playing. And Eddie, can I ask you to speak to leaders to take us out on this question. What can leaders do? What must leaders do to sort of put their money where their mouth is on this topic?
Yeah, again, I kind of think that we're looking for leadership in the wrong places. I think that the leaders are there. The leaders are the young people. The leaders are the the marginalized segments of society who are insisting on justice and who are insisting on equality. And I think, I don't know. I think we're all pretty exhausted about sort of asking for seats at the table. I think we're done with that. I think people are fed up. I think that, now it's a question of just amplifying those voices. I think we need to reimagine this whole language around inclusion, diversity, and sort of go beyond this tick boxing exercise that we're doing it in the name of compliance or in the name of rhetoric because it's like the right thing to do. I think that we need to have a more robust conversation about inclusion being the pathway to systems change and the kind of radical reimagining of the kind of society that we want to live in. And I think that kind of radical reimagining, frankly speaking, that conversation's being had, right? And that's where the leadership is. So I think we need to shift the conversation and look for leadership elsewhere.
And let those traditional leaders, maybe they just need to get out of the way and allow that to happen. So we just have 1 minute left and I have to go around the horn for this one because I want to hear lastly from each of you what citizens, especially our participants here at the SDG Action Zone, can do on this subject right now. When they log off from this incredible session and hearing from all three of you, what can our citizens do to actually move the ball on poverty and inequality? Let's go the other way now. Funmi, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I would say in a nutshell, I really loved what Eddie had to say because separating leaders from leadership is the way to go. If we went the way where leadership is exercised, we should ask people to align their voices with those who really are trying to make change happen. If it's not the person in the position of leader, find that leader and exercise leadership elsewhere. Align your voice with those who are asking the right questions and who are moving us in the right places. That's agency at its best.
And who are moving towards finding real answers, not just talking about it over and over again. Eddie, what about you? What's your call to action for citizens?
Call to action, solidarity, solidarity, solidarity. We need to push back against nationalism. We need to push back against a protectionist worldview. And we need to see ourselves as part of a whole. Right. And I think, the COVID-19 is a perfect example of that. We need to see ourselves as part of a global society and not just inwardly facing.
Because we actually are. I mean, that's the crazy thing about it. We actually are. It's just seeing the reality. And Olivier, I'll give you the last word. What's your call to action for citizens?
I think one major limiting factor is the lack of imagination. And what's enormously promising in the improved and greater involvement of ordinary people in politics and their activism is that it broadens the spectrum of possibilities because the social innovations that people invent, they are much more imaginative than the leaders in general, and they can be brought to the table and expand the range of our possibilities. So participation is not simply there to hold power to account, it's also there to help us succeed in finding the right solutions based on people's lived experiences.
That is a wonderful place for us to end. Thank you, thank you, thank you to Funmi, to Olivier, to Eddie, great friends of the SDG Action Zone and truly inspiring and visionary leaders. So if this is the future of leadership, I will take it. Thank you so much. And to all of you out there, don't forget to send us your questions and your thoughts using hashtag SDG Action Zone 2021 and hashtag for People for Planet. Thank you for an incredible opening plenary. We're going to go even deeper into these topics and so much more over all our programming here in the SDG Action Zone. So don't go anywhere.